Welcome to Modern Application Development Sessions, Week 7 Session 1. In this part of the course, we have reached a point where we are done with basic things such as CGI applications, and now we are going to do servlets, which are you can think of them as an efficient form of CGI if you want. But it turns out that they end up giving much more than that and is the preferred way of developing web applications once you are past using CGI bin to understand exactly how the data and control are flowing in the application. Okay, so our plan is as follows. We will understand how servlets work. We will understand the server as a kind of a miniature operating system, and we will start bringing together all the tools used so far in this session. As part of our demo this time, we will study the details of Tomcat and how it works as a servlet server, or as they call it, servlet container, and such other many different names get used. We will use the Tomcat instance that is shipped with XAMPP, but you can use any Tomcat install that you want. You can learn about it on the installation part on the web at the Tomcat site. And in this session, once your Tomcat is installed, we will look at how to get it configured and how it works. So far, we have seen the following stages of our application. We began by looking at a basic application, CGI bin style. Then we saw that you can have a GUI with a user, view, model, and a file store. Then we saw how the place of the view is taken by the browser, and the event loop between the server, between the user and the browser is connected with the server through the HTTP protocol, and then the server works with a database or a file store or what have you to store the information that you have sent. Next, we saw that the user connects to the browser and the server can be made to do different things using CGI and command line programs, and we saw that these programs communicate. The CGI command line program is a distinct process, and that it communicates using std in, std out, and goes to the and can use the database or file store as the case may be. Servlets is a further evolution of the server to CGI relationship. The result looks like the following. Here we have, as usual, the user, events, and the browser, and the HTTP protocol. However, this time there is an event loop inside the server which listens to the HTTP events, and when it receives some kind of a request, it creates an object called a HTTP request. This is a Java object this time, and a servlet is another object which offers interfaces for the functions get and post. There is a certain style of writing these interfaces that we will see when we look at the Java code. When a servlet is done, it creates a HTTP response object and sends it to the server event loop. Now, the HTTP request and the HTTP response objects contain exactly the same information that we have seen in HTTP requests and responses so far. So as we go further, we will see the details of how the HTTP request and HTTP response objects contain exactly the HTTP headers that we have seen in the previous sessions. Okay, now let's go ahead to our demo. In this demo, we will see how Tomcat is set up once you have the basics installed. And as usual, we will proceed by looking at simple servlets like Hello World and a few others. These are shipped with Tomcat, and it makes it very easy to get the basics of a system working. We will study the servlet API as we look at the code for these servlets, and then we will discuss things such as mapping URLs to servlets and what the Tomcat management pages contain, as we go ahead with the demo. So we are in the XAMPP directory and we start the XAMPP control. This contains a nice console to help us start Tomcat, and it's attempting to start Tomcat. There we go. So it's telling us that Tomcat is process ID 896 and it is running on these 3 ports, of which 8080 is the one that we are interested in. So let's see what it shows when we do this. Okay, so to get started, Tomcat comes with many of these kinds of things: documentation, configuration, examples, etc. Built into the install, and then it is telling us that things are all okay. So let's see what all it has. So we have the documentation here, localhost 8080 docs notice, and here is the documentation. Now, of course, the problem is that right now, when we are not familiar with it, this documentation is not very helpful. Nonetheless, let's take a look. We'll go through only the parts that we need so far. So here, this kind of a thing, generally these documentations suddenly jump into telling you all the details before they go into any kind of conceptual description, which is fine. These are written as you start getting more and more familiar with the details. So in this, so far we won't rely too much on the documentation just yet. I'm only getting you to familiarize yourself with it. So here is the first web application. What I want you to notice in this is that after basics like introduction and installation, there is an element called deployment organization. We have already discussed some of this in doing CGI, when we saw that CGI files, for instance, are put in the CGI bin directory, whereas the HTML that actually shows you the application is kept in htdocs and so forth under Apache. Similarly, there is a setup that is involved in Tomcat as well. Let's just go and look at the Apache thing to make this concrete. Let's start Apache. So here we are starting Apache, and it started on port 80 and 443. Note that here, because Tomcat runs on 8080 and Apache on port 80, we can have them both running at the same time. And so we go here, and this shows us our familiar list of files. Now, if you take a look at something like this one, FairShare 3, notice that FairShare 3 itself came from the so-called root directory, which we know actually corresponds to htdocs. So this is the htdocs directory, and the htdocs contains these things which we see as the root directory as far as Apache is concerned. And now we have our application. Let's do this, submit the form. Notice, by the way, that it takes quite a bit of time for our application to run. One of the first things you will notice with servlets is that it doesn't take quite so much time at all. And so here we have FairShare, but the point is this is in CGI bin and rather than in htdocs. So go here and we have our CGI bin, and here we have the FairShare docs that we have seen before. So just like there is some notion of organization here, there is also a similar notion of organization for Tomcat. And in this directory, you can see what that organization is like. As usual with the web systems, you have conf, lib, and logs, and especially the existence of conf and logs is sort of characteristic of most web applications. As you might expect, the conf directory contains configurations and logs contain logs. So let's see what we have. We have a bunch of configuration tools here, configuration files, and in logs we have, as one might expect, various different logs. We'll become more familiar with it. As we have seen, logs and where they are kept is one of the key elements of understanding a web application. Okay, let's get back to our main Tomcat, which we have started, and we can see this page. Now here, if you go to the Manager app, if you click the Manager app button over here, it comes up with a password. This kind of authentication is built into web servers, and we will see how to use some of that. However, right now, if you try whatever default passwords it suggests, it turns out that it doesn't work. And if you say cancel, this thing tells you why. So it says you should look for conf tomcat users XML, and you should add roles like this manager GUI, which allows us to go to the manager part of the application. And it says that there are different roles according to what people can see. As time has passed, people noticed that for various security reasons, you need fairly fine-grained access to the various tools that are available to the web server. So let's take a look at how to change this. As this documentation suggests, we are in conf and we have tomcat users.xml. And here I have already prepared some of these things, but this is what you will have to type in your Tomcat directory. You have username, and for now I just put in the same thing, username and password. This is a terrible idea, which only makes sense for as they say, educational purposes. But in real life, you have to take your password seriously. It is bad enough that they are stored in files and so on, but at least they should be somewhat more unpredictable. Okay, with that caution, for now we will go and change this configuration and save it, and then we need to restart Tomcat. So let's stop Tomcat and start it. Okay, here we go. Tomcat is running. We go back, and this time we know what to put in the manager app. We will put manager and manager. So now the manager application is working. So first of all, just like we had different fair share applications in Apache, we have different manager applications. We have different applications such as the manager in Tomcat. Let's go back and start this in a new tab. Okay, here we are. So here it tells us that there is a docs app, there is an examples app, and there is the manager app itself. There are a number of different commands available for working with these applications. And down below you will see that you can deploy your own applications, which is what we will do later. These applications are organized in what are called web archive files, which is to say WAR files. And you can deploy these applications directly from the manager. So already Tomcat has given us a more methodical way of organizing applications, whereas for the CGI bin applications that we saw, we had to do come up with an organization ourselves. Experience with CGI bin and knowing how to deal with them, eventually Tomcat and these kinds of servers were written much after the experience with Apache in the early days, and so the configuration part of it is now baked into these web servers. All right, let's run the examples app. And in the examples app, we have servlet examples, JSP examples, WebSocket, and so on. So let's take a look at servlet examples. So here we have a bunch of examples, and one nice thing about Tomcat is this page. I like this idea very much, that the whole thing is packaged together with the basic examples so that you can just look at what they are doing and understand the details. So one thing to note, by the way, the source code that we can see is not actually all the source code, but we will take a look at it. We will take a look at the real source code anyway. They said that they have removed all these details, which is fine, but to get the code working, you do need all the details. So first of all, we have hello world and things are working fine. There is this particular style example, servlet hello world example, which is kind of the equivalent of the CGI-bin that comes with the CGI files. And if you want to see what is happening, of course, there is nothing very different. If you load it, there is a GET request and response headers and so on and so forth. A few things that are worth looking at. I think that's interesting. The response says server is Apache Coyote. I suppose it's some sort of a thing to understand what is, instead of returning Tomcat, they are returning Apache Coyote. Let's see what else is here. Okay, anyhow, we'll check out what Apache-Coyote is about and discuss this. At any rate, here is hello world. And if we look at the source for this thing, by the way, this source application is actually served by a GET request, and the GET request, it manufactures this file, as we will see, since they said that this is not actually the source that corresponds to the code. It is highlighting what is essential about this. So let's take a look. What is essential is these things. So the servlet API is available, and hello world extends HTTP servlet, and then it has this particular function which corresponds to the get method call that we actually see in this particular example. So here we have, let's say, reload, and here we have the familiar get method. Corresponding to this get method, this function doGet is executed, and it gets two inputs, the request object and the response object. And these objects are the ones that I was talking about in this diagram here. So this is the HTTP request object, and this is the HTTP response object. It is actually called HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response. This is the somewhat standard verbosity of Java, but that's all right. So, and then what this does in its essence, by the way, not in the actual code, is to set this set content type text HTML, and here if we go look at the hello world example and the hello world app, let's see. So in the hello world response headers, we have this content type getting set text HTML. That part is done by this response content type call, and the rest is standard Java isms. You have print writer, and which is associated with the response object again, and now you start writing to it. So out, print line, etc., etc. If you compare this with CGI, in CGI we were using straight system out print line, and that was the one which was eventually getting shown to the user. Instead, here we have a print writer which is associated with a response object. Now let's take a look at what the actual code looks like. The actual code has, as they say, quite a few more details. In particular, these servlet APIs, we explicitly pull them in, and we have the following. So public class hello world example, etc., etc., HTTP servlet. We'll take a look at what all this serial version ID, etc., is for. Here we have do get, and there's a bunch of things like locales and all, which are sort of standard things to do to make sure that the execution is according to the expectations of your local user. But that is a detail we won't get into too much. We will speak briefly about locales and how to adjust things in such a way that they are friendly to people who are not necessarily from your country and so forth, but we won't be spending much time on that. So here we have these details, and as you can see, other than some of the more nuanced things like images and their contents and so on, this image, by the way, is this thing here, and we can see the kind of code that it shows. The page was actually itself an HTML page, and so these are the kinds of things for this one. So for instance, the colors, etc., are done explicitly, and for hello world itself, it is page source is this thing. So that's what we are putting out over here. So we have height 24, width 24, etc., etc. Overall, the code that we have seen is laid out in the following way. So first of all, inside Tomcat, we have web apps. And inside web apps, we have all the different applications, including examples. And as you can see, these are the elements. We won't be looking at, we'll mostly look at servlets and JSP, and the WebSocket, etc. We won't be looking at that much. Here what we have is the servlets, which is the actual, hello world and so on, much as there is htdocs in the world of CGI bin. And then this is what we see when we look at this kind of hello world HTML. This is the summary of the code that they showed us. And the application itself is in webinf followed by, so there is a bunch of standard things here. There's supposed to be something called web.xml. There is supposed to be classes and JSP and lib, which is various libraries. So classes, we have all these kinds of things. So here, this is the code that we were looking at, hello world example.java. Now let's take a look at some of the other things that are included in Tomcat. So we have more servlet examples. In particular, these show you how, for example, the information in a request, in this case, it analyzes this URL and says we have this method, we have this URI, this protocol, pretty much the same thing that we were doing with the various shell scripts and environments, except it is done through Java objects. Then we have this, the request headers. As you can see, all the standard request headers are available. And if you take a look at the code for this thing, this will show you what is going on. Get writer, and then you get the header names, and for each one of them, ask the request object to get the value for that header. So this is more or less identical to the kind of thing we were doing before. Let me see. Here is our postdata.sh file, and here we were collecting all the data in the post, and we had a number of things in the from HTTP, and we started printing it out through this array called the environment. This is essentially the same thing. The request object corresponds to the environment array, and it contains all of these different elements. If you go through this code, you will it's very easy to learn what the system is doing, and as we develop our app further, we will use these examples as our starting points and show you how these kinds of things get implemented. Okay, so to summarize, we have this sort of setup. We have these HTTP servlet request and servlet response and do get, do post. And then we have seen a few examples of these servlets. We saw a hint of what this servlet API, which is exactly what those do get, do post and the request response objects are. Then we will take a little bit of a look at how URLs are and servlets are mapped, and what the rest of the management pages contain. So for this part of the session, let's summarize. We have seen the basics of servlets. Then we will wrap our existing CGI file as a servlet and finally change it to look like our GUI app. Thank you. Let's see you in the next part of this session.